We're joined once again by Parag Khanna, author of How to Run the World and Senior Research Fellow at the New America Foundation. This is the second installment in our four-part conversation with Parag. Today, we want to talk about a key part of international relations and interaction, and that is diplomacy. As traditional diplomatic channels change, a new bottom-up approach may be emerging. What does that mean for relationship building? Hello again, Parag.
Hello.
You write a lot about the need for diplomacy to change, but before we explore that, tell me the current model of diplomacy.
Well, the way we tend to think about diplomacy today is we hold it synonymous with intergovernmental relations, so bilateral relationships between the United States and Canada and the UK and so forth, and then multilateral organizations, whether it's the United Nations or NATO or the World Trade Organization. There's a lot wrong with that in theory, right? Because in the history of diplomacy, there's been very wide participation beyond just governments, right? Private individuals, companies, churches and religious groups, universities even, throughout history have been a part of the diplomatic dialogue that shapes global affairs, not just states. It's only in the last couple of hundred years that states have dominated. The other problem with it is very real and tangible and empirical, and that is that the world governed just by governments and international organizations has been in place for a long time, particularly in the post-World War II order, and it has failed to make the world a perfectly stable, well-governed, orderly, predictable kind of place. It does not have the resources to actually manage all of the turbulence that we see around the world today. We need more diplomacy, meaning we have to go back, in my view, to a much older model in which you have this more universal participation.
Okay, tell me where we need to go back for. What kind of changes are we calling for?
Right. Now, the first change is psychological. We have been trained or to believe since literally Immanuel Kant's political writings in the 18th century that evolution in global governance means that you move towards ever more centralized yet universalized laws and bureaucracies and institutions, right? The idea of one single world government type of thing. And people believe that any move towards that is a sign of progress, of evolution. Look, it's part of the Canadian international diplomatic psychology to believe that as well. Now, what I'm telling you is that that's completely wrong. I'm telling you that has to be turned completely on its head. And I'm saying that because of globalization. Because if globalization does any one thing, it distributes power, it diffuses power, it decentralizes power and authority, it empowers individuals, communities, cities, companies, NGOs, whatever the case may be, right? Where's the voice for all of them? Right? They have it, globalization gives it to them. Where's their place in that old diplomatic model? They don't have it. Therefore, that model has to go. The new reality of globalization makes us, or forces us to think about what this new hybrid, public-private, mixed-up kind of diplomacy would look like. Bottom-up diplomacy, as I call it, or mega diplomacy, really, in which you really think just way beyond governments. And again, if you want to get the resources on the table to fix the world's problems, well, you've absolutely reached the upper limit of what you will ever get from the world's governments under present conditions.
What you're advocating, though, is, a fundamental seismic shift. And you talk about this bottom-up. How do we make it work in any kind of practicality?
Well, it is the practical reality. It's not that I'm proposing some kind of theoretical modification that I really hope one day the world's leaders will adopt. I'm telling you exactly how the world works today, and I'm telling you our leaders and our academics actually haven't caught up to the reality. Because if you want to look at how entire places and regions are governed in the world today, they're governed exactly the way I'm describing it, right? We talked earlier about the sort of post-colonial world, the fragmented, poor, almost collapsing societies. Well, who runs those countries? In Lebanon, it's Hezbollah is an actor. Is that the government? No, it's a parallel state, right? In India, it's self-employed cooperatives of women's groups, of labor unions, all sorts of things going on there. It's NGOs that provide a huge amount of education around India. So country after country, society after society, you see the actual governance is more than just what the government does. Now, getting it back to diplomacy and managing regional affairs, we are missing this whole regional level. But when you think about what makes, who governs Asia, Is it the United Nations? And not last time I checked, right? Asian governance is this incredibly complicated system that involves, yes, the governments of China, Korea, Japan, India, Australia, Indonesia, and so forth, but also this deepening interconnections among the supply chains of Asian companies, the ways in which they're trading with each other, investing in each other's countries, building airports and low-cost airline carriers to connect people, joint regional institutions, Asian Monetary Fund, Asian Development Bank, Asian Peacekeeping Force. Where's the global governance in that? Who's running that, right? So to me, there's a hugely complex multi-level set of models out there that always involve universities and NGOs and companies every bit as much as they involve governments, and yet we just fail to see it. But the reality in most of the entire world is exactly that.
Okay, if that's the reality,
Right.
You also say that governments and academics don't buy in or haven't caught up. Why not, and what's it going to take for them to then catch up?
Well, we cling to the idea that the ideal world is one in which most of the world is catching up to the Western state-centric, strong nation-state model, right? But most of the world, I absolutely give you a written guarantee, is never going to catch up to that theoretical model or to our very fortunate reality here in the West. Most of the world will never catch up to that. So why live in a fantasy world, right? So take the example of Nigeria. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. It is one of the most powerful countries in Africa. It's certainly considered a real mover and shaker, a real influencer on the continent. Who runs Nigeria? What makes Nigeria work? This is not a trivial question because, again, it's probably the most important country in all of Africa. Well, in my book, I have a section where I trace the history of Royal Dutch Shell, the energy company, the oil company in Nigeria. What I try to demonstrate is that what makes Nigeria Nigeria is not that they have this competent government that invited in a Western oil company, produced lots of oil, and yes, there was lots of corruption, but the government still is in charge. Absolutely not. That space known as Nigeria is a co-governance project of a major oil company and this thing known as the Nigerian government. And that together makes the state. That government and that state would not survive today were it not for the hand of that oil company from another continent over the last 40 years. They co-run that country. And that's a big country we're talking about. So the diplomacy between Shell and Nigeria is way more important than the diplomacy between Nigeria and just about any other country on the planet Earth. That's the way you think about this public-private diplomacy that I'm talking about.
Where else do you see it in the world?
Well, again,
working.
Just about, it's not to say that Nigeria works, because it really doesn't work well at all.
So where does it work?
A foreign policy's failed states index, yet again, puts it in the bottom 20, right? It would be aspirational that the Nigerian government would take the helm, take charge, let's nation build, right? It hasn't happened in 50 years. How much longer are you going to wait, right? Now, let's look at Afghanistan. Afghanistan is still a very big mess. But tell me, how long would it take for the Afghan government to have a health ministry, an education ministry, a public infrastructure spanning the entire country, run by the central government in a competent fashion without foreign outside dependence?
A long time.
A long time. How much faster will it happen if you have some kind of coordinated mechanism among NGOs who build schools and hospitals, international agencies that help contribute to infrastructure, foreign investors who come in, mining companies from China, the US military, all of these in a very complicated, messy, and overlapping and totally poorly coordinated mix. But if you were to work on getting that better, do you think Afghanistan would have what it needs faster than if it had to do it all itself?
Possibly, but here's the question then. For what you're advocating, you never really have this centralized government structure that we are so used to, maybe been conditioned to, but there is no kind of place, one institution, if we can call that, where sort of authority, responsibility remains.
And that is what scares people. And you asked earlier, what is it that, why are academics and intellectuals and others sort of blinded to this? Because, we're wedded to this aspiration that we're going to get to that perfect world, and we're not going to get to that world. Instead we have to accept this reality. And again, what is Russia other than the energy revenues that Gazprom and other companies generate? Why is it that the president of the country, Dmitry Medvedev, right, is the former CEO of Gazprom? This is not an accident, right? corporate states. What is a state other than what it can economically survive as and provide for its people as? Otherwise, it will change its own definition. So most countries are in a very precarious state, actually, where who holds the levers of the economy, and that's very often the businesses, really prop up the state as we think of it from the outside.
I want to ask you about the UN, because when people think of diplomacy, they often think of the UN.
Yeah.
Every year, the UN adds new countries, new members. How is the UN changing diplomacy today?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a very good thing that the UN plays that official function of being the repository of universal recognition of new states, because I happen to be a fairly radical Wilsonian, who a century ago as American president promulgated this self-determination in the 14 points before and after World War I. And I happen to think that that project is not yet complete, which is why we have, again, twice as many countries in the world today as we had just 50 or 60 years ago. So evidence is clearly on my side here. And guess what country was just born? South Sudan. Who's declaring independence later this year? Palestine. What may come next? Kurdistan. Kosovo a couple of years ago. East Timor a decade ago. We're creating new states all the time. The United Nations plays a very important function in participating in the diplomacy around state creation. That is what its precursor, the League of Nations, was instrumental in doing as well. But all parts of the UN are not to be treated alike, right? I mean, the incredible stasis and political maneuvering as incredibly disingenuous, but I don't like to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Actually, in this book, I present a very vigorous defense of what are called the functional agencies of the United Nations, the World Food Program, UNICEF, and so forth. These are the bodies that really do something. They save lives every single day, right? And they even innovate new models of how to go about accomplishing their missions. In fact, some of them, because they actually have very small budgets, do the best job of working with the private sector and with NGOs, doing this bottom-up organic hybrid diplomacy because they have to, because they can't afford to. I wish that they would actually get more resources and be able to do more of the important work they do. Look at the UN Refugee Agency and the way it's sprung into action in Turkey because of Syrian refugees, and the way they've been operating in Syria for a long time with the Iraqi refugees, the way they've been operating in Pakistan with Afghan refugees for decades, literally, on a shoestring budget. Those are functional agencies. They really matter. They get Nobel Peace Prizes every few years. They deserve them. So when I say United Nations, I never mean to sort of say it's all one thing or it's take it or leave it, right? There are parts of the UN that I think are absolutely heroic and essential.
Earlier in the summer, we had an author, Don Tapscott, on who looks at the internet and how the world is changing. And he talks about the importance of collaboration and the tools that are available online and just to what extent it's helping people organize and fundamentally change how the world works. How do you see the internet affecting diplomacy?
Right. And what I call a mega diplomacy, I really should, taking a page from Don, I should call it Wiki Diplomacy. And I think people would understand immediately what I mean, because that is exactly what I'm talking about. And the internet does make these kinds of collaborations easier. Now, let's do a little sort of pop quiz. What is the great revolution in poverty alleviation of the last decades, and where did it come from? Was it a World Bank diktat called microcredit, or was it a microcredit innovation that came from Bangladesh and other countries and then spread through knowledge diffusion around the world like this? And now there's microcredit everywhere on the planet Earth, including the United States and probably in Canada too, right? Did you need a centralized bureaucratic organ to tell people that this is what they needed to do? No. In fact, they didn't even have the idea. Let's take an even bigger issue, just as big, climate change, right? Where are the breakthrough technologies coming from to help mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and climate change? Are they coming from the United Nations Environment Program? Are they coming from the World Environment Organization that many people like to propose that we need? Absolutely not. We don't need them. We never need a single new bureaucracy ever on this planet. We don't need it because we have the internet, because we have learning, because we have the ability for resources to transfer directly from me to you. If you need it, if you're that farmer, if you're that person who's trying to have a better irrigation system, whatever it is that you're trying to do, I can get the resources from me to you. I don't need a middleman. I don't need a UN agency. I don't need someone telling us how to do it right. You know best, and I can help you with the resources I have. That is wiki diplomacy. It is far outpaced traditional diplomacy. There's far more of it. It's happening all the time. It's so hard to grasp, which is why we're groping for a model that doesn't really exist.
We have just under a minute left, Parag, but I want to ask you, to the barriers that you said to mega diplomacy are governments and academics and those sort of traditional thinkers that need to change. Anything else stand out for you as a real barrier to mega diplomacy working?
Well, inertia, right? Again, it's this notion that we have to look to one centralized authority for our roadmap, for our guideposts as to what to do, right? And it's very interesting because I hear this question pretty often saying, where are the leaders across the world, in the Arab world and so forth? When are the new leaders going to emerge? As if they're waiting for a new Gamal Abdel Nasser to kind of come out of the woodwork. And so forth. I say, look, turn on your television. Those are the leaders. Why does it have to be one person, right? Why does it have to be someone who descends from the heavens or is elected in some clean, natural way? That may not happen for a long time. Those are the leaders. I'm looking to lots of leaders, not one leader. And I think that's, again, just a symptomatic of the psychological hurdle we have to overcome.
Great conversation. Thanks, Parag.
Thank you.